The news on BFM 89.9.
Here are the main stories at 5:30 p.m. Malaysia Airlines forecasts domestic travel to resume by the middle of this year. Group Chief Marketing and Customer Experience Officer Lau Yin Mei says they are hopeful that travel across Asia will begin at the end of 2021.
And if you look into really international to all the other continents, to be honest, to retain back to the 2019 numbers, it wouldn't be as soon as until at least mid of 2023 onwards. So we do need to continue to sustain, and also to assist the tourism industry as much as possible. So we are working with the ministry specifically and also other travel industry players to encourage and to stimulate as much domestic travel.
Separately, the Association of Private Hospitals Malaysia has welcomed Putrajaya's move to allow them to negotiate with suppliers for the purchase of Covid-19 vaccines. However, it says procurement planning has to kick off now for the vaccines to be available for dispensing by mid this year and not towards Q3 and Q4. Meanwhile, epidemiology professor Dr. Moy Fung Ming told BFM that a private COVID-19 vaccination program will drive inoculation inequities. However, she believes there will be less competition between the private and public sector if it is introduced at the end of the year.
As our government has signed a contract with maybe a lower price, and if the private sector come in and then they give a higher price, the supplier may choose to deliver to the ones that giving a higher price. Hence, the government will get the supply later. So then that means that the rich ones will get their vaccine earlier than those who are waiting for the free vaccine.
Elsewhere, BP Healthcare Group Vice President Garvy told BFM News COVID-19 testing will remain relevant even as vaccinations increase nationwide. He also expects a slight drop in the number of screenings carried out.
But we look at other countries such as US, Germany and France. Even though vaccine have been rolled out way before us and still they go back to lockdown. Why? It's because this virus is mutating continuously and the vaccine has to play a catch-up game. Because a vaccine to produce, to get it approved, to logistically deliver and to jab, it takes a long time and virus is mutated already.
In other news, PKR President Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim says it is up to UMNO leaders to decide the future of the party, adding that a possible collaboration was merely in the discussion stage. He was responding to remarks by UMNO President Datuk Sri Zaid Hamidi, who dismissed talk of a possible pact between UMNO and PKR.
I say in discussions, I discuss all parties. I was with Anifah Haman just now. In a democracy and in a mature process, we need to be able to engage. It's very important. Based on the core values and principles. Because otherwise, if we doubt this being agreed, we have seen the limitations even of our Pakatan Harapan government. So if we have learned our lesson, we cannot compromise on these shared principles.
Meanwhile, former Prime Minister Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad says UMNO still has not gathered enough strength to face a general election and form a government, even if it recently declared that it does not want to work with Bersatu.
Kerana dia pun bergantung kepada Bersatu, seperti Bersatu bergantung kepada dia. Dia cuma tarik diri daripada Bersatu kalau ada kumpulan lain yang bekerjasama dengan dia dan mempunyai cukup bilang untuk tubuh kerajaan baru. Tapi setakat ini tak ada, saya nampaklah siapa-siapa yang cukup bilang boleh bekerjasama dengan UMNO.
In Myanmar, activists have launched a strike against the military by piling up rubbish on the streets of Yangon. This comes as the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners said at least 510 civilians had been killed in the military's efforts to stop the protests. In football, Liverpool striker Roberto Firmino has returned to training after recovering from a knee injury ahead of this weekend's Premier League trip to Arsenal. In business news, Radar found that 64% of its property industry survey respondents had unsold residential stock in the second half of 2020, while 33% had unsold commercial stock. President Datuk Swam Heng Chun told BFM News many developers also believe that it is not the right time to launch commercial projects.
But flip side is that because of the requirements of social distancing, later on when we open up for businesses that still require their staff to be present, maybe they will require a bit more space. So I think these are all rejigging in the works. Things will become clearer in the coming months. Most of the developer surveyed, they actually launched the simple shop offices for retail that they have is usually at the bottom of the service apartment.
Separately, glove chlorination systems provider Flexi Dynamic Holdings debuted on the ACE market this morning at 69 sen a share, up 245% from its issue price of 20 sen. General Manager Sin Kuo Wei told BFM News this marked strong confidence from investors in its business prospects.
The IPO proceeds will be used to finance the acquisition of new factories as well as new machineries and equipment. Part of the proceeds will be allocated for working capital, while the remaining proceeds to defray the IPO listing expenses.
And South Korea's Hyundai Motor will suspend production for a week at its Ulsan No. 1 plant from April 7th due to a shortage of semiconductor chips and supply issues with electrical components. In markets, the FBM KLCI closed down 0.1% at 1,609 points. Asian markets closed mostly lower, with Shanghai's composite losing 0.9%, while Singapore's STI gained 0.1%.
The BFM Traffic Report.
According to Waze, an accident near Jalan Batu Tiga Lama is causing congestion on the federal highway. Meanwhile, there's unusual traffic on Jalan Kinrara in Puchong and Jalan Sultan Ismail in KL. I'm Sabrina Magdalene. For more headlines, follow BFM News on Twitter. You are now up to date on BFM 89.9, the business station.
The news on BFM 89.9.
Here are the main stories at 6 p.m. The conditional MCO at Selangor, Kuala Lumpur, Johor, Pulau Pinang, Kelantan and Sarawak will be extended as these states are still recording high number of COVID-19 infections. Meanwhile, the recovery MCO at the rest of the states and federal territories will also be maintained. Defence Minister Datuk Sri Ismail Sabri Yaakob adds that interstate travel is still prohibited.
Pengekalan status bagi negeri-negeri ini akan berkuasa bermula 1 April sehingga 14 April kecuali Sarawak yang bermula hari ini 30 Mac sehingga 12 April. Walaupun rentas negeri masih tidak dibenarkan kecuali bagi aktiviti pelancongan dari negeri PKPP ke negeri PKPP menggunakan syarikat dan ejen pelancongan.
Meanwhile, Langkawi MP Tun Dr. Mati Muhammad says tourists who have taken their 2 COVID-19 vaccine doses should be allowed to visit Langkawi in a bid to revive the island's tourism sector. He adds traders are feeling relieved as tourists from the mainland, especially Kedah, have started entering the island. The ferry schedule is now reaching 5 trips daily, carrying 600 people each time. BP Healthcare Group will participate in the COVID-19 vaccinations under the National Immunization Program. Vice President Garvy told BFM News they also plan to open new medical centres, including in Malacca and Kapong.
We, BP, has been speaking to MOH and the governing body. We will be enrolled as a vaccination centre as well under phase 2. And nationwide, all our BP will be enrolled and we will support the government to help vaccinate as many people as possible.
Briefly, the DAP National Congress will be held simultaneously on June 20th in Shah Alam, Kota Kinabalu and Kuching. UMNO MP Khairi Jamaluddin has called on his party to hold its elections immediately to solve the ongoing internal chaos. He says UMNO should not suspend the party elections until after a general election. Meanwhile, Ilham Centre Research Fellow Hamidin Hamid believes UMNO's pledge to strengthen Sharia laws could strain relations with Barisan Nasional component parties. He told BFM President Datuk Sri Zaid Hamidi has also failed to effectively manage emerging factions within the party.
The message that came out from the General Assembly is very much confusing. I think the statements about Sharia law is very much to please pass rather than a clear indications of what's the direction of UMNO. And then obviously it will raise a lot of eyebrows and hands among the non-Malays component party within the BN. And I think will make the party from Sabah and Sarawak more distant from UMNO and Barisan Nasional.
In other news, the Centre to Combat Corruption and Cronyism has called on the government to implement legislation to improve accountability in the plastic waste industry. Researcher Wong Pui Yi told BFM a lack of transparency would impede public efforts to report on law-breaking behaviours.
We really need to have more transparency, have more public accountability and public participation. When people make complaints, listen to them instead of ignoring them. And when you make policies, we hope that the government would have more substantive public engagement with the people, especially the local people around the area if you're going to invest your life in the area, so that people can make informed decisions.
In Vietnam, a court handed a 2-year suspended jail term to a Vietnam Airlines flight attendant for breaching his quarantine rules and spreading COVID-19. The 29-year-old mingled with dozens of people after his flight from Japan in November, infecting 3 individuals and costing Ho Chi Minh City over $190,000 to test about 2,000 people in the city. In business news, iProperty reports the national demand for residential rental property contracted by nearly 13% in 2020. However, General Manager Shailendra Nathan says he is optimistic the market will begin to show signs of recovery in the first half of 2021.
We also saw a slight drop in the rental yield from 3.4% to 3.3%. This situation obviously favors the tenant as opposed to the landlord. There is going to be huge competition among landlords, given this situation in the market. There's a lot of inventory that is available, and there may be some landlords with less holding power, thus may drive more lenient prices.
Separately, Funding Societies Malaysia is keen to explore partnerships with banks, but believes that such partnerships will only be more meaningful when it is a bigger player. CEO Wong Kah Meng told BFM's Breakfast Grill it is working on other collaborations for now, on top of existing partnerships with U-Mobile and Lazada.
We have seen it been picking up, especially of late. Some of these partners are really selling a digital proposition, right? And the whole COVID situation has sort of prompted to move SMEs towards exploring all these digital propositions. And I think that's where the traction is coming from. We are looking forward to announcing 1 or 2 major partnerships in the coming months. There will be other types of tech and corporates.
And Human Equation founder Sheila Singham says the lack of female business leadership in Malaysia could mainly be attributed to the reluctance of most major companies to elevate women to senior positions. She told BFM only 17% of local businesses are actively setting targets to achieve gender parity.
We may like to think that we are a very progressive society here in Malaysia, but apparently not progressive enough. 17 is dismal. And in terms of actively working on removing barriers to gender parity at senior levels, only 60% of Malaysian businesses are endeavouring to do so. This is the lowest number in the ASEAN region. Almost all other countries scored about 70%, with Vietnam leading at 100%.
In markets, the FEM KLCI closed down 0.1% at 1,609 points. Singapore's STI was up 0.5% at 3,191 points. Elsewhere, European markets are in the green, with France's CAC 0.5% higher, while the UK's FTSE rose 0.4%. And on the forex market, $1 is now worth 4 ringgit 15 sen, while £1 is worth 5 ringgit 71.
The BFM Traffic Report.
According to Waze, traffic is slow moving on the Subang Airport Road from the Subang Airport roundabout heading to Kampung Baru Subang due to an accident. Meanwhile, expect congestion on Jalan Utama in Sri Kembangan and on Jalan Parliament in KL. I'm Sabrina Magdalene. For more headlines, follow BFM News on Twitter. You are now up to date on BFM 89.9, the business station.